3 men surrounded her table, in broad daylight in a room full of people, and nobody moved. The man with the silver watch leaned over her wheelchair and said she was taking up too much space. His friends laughed. The whole diner went quiet, that spiffy, cowardly quiet of people deciding that looking away was safer than speaking up. She didn't flinch, didn't beg, just sat there with her spine straight and her hands flat on the keyboard, holding herself together with everything she had. That's when the man in the back corner downed his coffee. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. Just stood up and walked across the room like he'd already decided exactly what was going to happen next. 4 words. You should sit down, they said. But here's what nobody in that diner saw, what nobody knew until much later. While he was handling those 3 men, one of them had already crouched down and done something to her wheelchair. Something deliberate, something that would have made her lose control at speed. And that was only the beginning. Clover Hill, Virginia, population just under 10,000. The kind of town where the hardware store owner knows your truck by sound, where the diner hasn't changed its menu in 11 years, where people nod at strangers on the sidewalk not because they're friendly, but because they've decided strangers probably aren't dangerous until proven otherwise. Jeffrey Mercer had lived here 3 years. 3 years was enough to stop being a stranger. Not enough to stop being noticed. He pulled into the lot behind Millstone Diner at 7:24 in the morning, the October air sharp enough to mean business. The kind of cold that came in low and got under your collar before you'd taken 3 steps from the truck. The Ford was black, 12 years old, dented above the rear wheel well where a customer's sedan had kissed it in a parking lot 18 months ago. He'd never fixed the dent. There was always something more urgent. Owen was already out of the truck before it fully stopped. 8 years old, constitutionally choked to waiting for anything to come to a complete rest. Walk! Jeffrey didn't look up from pulling his keys out. Parking lot. I am walking. Owen demonstrated walking by walking extremely fast, which was running with better legal footing. Jeffrey locked the truck, followed at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, deliberate. The kind of pace that that noted the red Dodge with the cracked taillight, the older woman getting out of a Subaru near the door, the teenager on a bike cutting across the far corner. Old habit. The kind that settled into your body so deep it stopped feeling like habit and started feeling like breathing. The bell above Millstone's door was the same bell that had been there since 1974. Sandra Ogle claimed her grandmother had installed it and that replacing it would break some kind of continuity in the fabric of the universe. No one had tested that theory. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon grease and something sweet baking in the back, probably the corn muffins Sandra made on cold mornings without announcing she was doing it. The light was yellow and warm. The vinyl booths were red, faded toward orange in the spots where decades of elbows had worked on them. 3 farmers in the front corner were already arguing about soil drainage, their voices carrying the easy combativeness of men who had been arguing with each other about the same topics. For so long, the argument had become a kind of companionship. Jeffrey took the booth in the far back corner. Left side of the room, back to the wall, clear sight line to the door, always. Owen dropped his backpack on the seat beside him, with the sound of someone who had never once in his life thought a backpack deserved to be set down gently. He pulled out a sketchbook. Not a school sketchbook, a personal one, thick and battered, the cover decorated with a pencil drawing of what appeared to be an ankylosaurus fighting a forklift. Context unclear. Jeffrey had learned not to ask for context with Owen's drawings. Saw a T-Rex, open to a fresh page without looking, if they fought in a swamp. Settled into the booth corner, straight satire, aquatic advantage. Owen considered this with genuine scientific gravity. But T-Rex has the bite force, doesn't matter in water, if you can't maneuver. Spinosaurus arms are also weird. Most things that look weird have a reason. Owen looked up, studied his father for a moment with that particular 8-year-old expression that was 3 parts processing and 1 part suspicion that the adult was making a larger point. Then he went back to drawing. Sandra appeared with coffee before Jeffrey had his jacket fully off. She was 61, silver-haired, and had been reading people for so long she'd stopped needing to pay attention to do it. She set the mug down, filled it, left the carafe, and was gone before he'd formed a word.
This was the language regular tenderness.
No need for ceremony. He wrapped his hands around the mug, let the warmth settle. 3 years in Clover Hill. He'd bought the garage from Ray Briggs, who'd run it for 31 years, and decided his knees had been telling him something he should have listened to 5 years earlier. The purchase had taken everything Jeffrey had saved in the last 2 years of service, plus a bank loan he still woke up thinking about some mornings. 20 months to pay off. 6 months after that, before the client list reached the point where he wasn't doing math every time he bought groceries. Not wealthy, not struggling. Stable in the way that meant he'd made the thing work, which was what he'd set out to do, and that was enough. Rebecca had grown up 20 miles from here. That was part of it. Some irrational thing in him had wanted Owen close to that geography, close to the county where she'd learned to drive and spent summers and complained about the heat. Like proximity to the place meant something. Like the land held something she'd left in it. Irrational, he knew. He'd chosen it anyway. 3 years ago, she'd been gone 31 days. He'd closed the door to their apartment in Chesapeake, put Owen in the truck with a stuffed dog named Roger that Owen had since outgrown but still kept on the shelf in his room, and driven southwest until the town felt right. He couldn't have explained what right felt like. He'd know it when he felt it. He'd felt it pulling into Clover Hill at dusk, the mountains going blue behind the buildings, the diner lights on. Her last communication to him had been written. Her voice had been too thin by then. Too much effort per word, and she'd known it and hated it and solved the problem the way she always solved out problems. Practically, completely, without waiting for someone else to hand her a solution. She'd written it on a piece of notebook paper in the last week, folded it once, given it to him without saying what it was. He'd read it in the hospital parking garage, alone, sitting in the truck in the dark. Don't let yourself become the lonely hero in his head. He needs to see you need people. He carried it in his wallet, didn't look at it. Just knew it was there. Owen had started drawing something with 4 legs and what appeared to be an impractical number of teeth. What's that? It's a hypothetical. Owen didn't look up. I'm still working out the biology. Jeffrey drank his coffee. The morning light came through the front windows at the low October angle that turned everything amber for about 40 minutes before it climbed enough to stop being interesting. He opened the small notebook from his jacket pocket. Invoice from yesterday's brake job on the Harmon pickup. Part order for the Waverly transmission. He needed to call before 10. School pickup at 3:15 unless football practice ran late, which Coach Delaney had a habit of allowing because Coach Levichton had no children and therefore no concept of what 4 p.m. meant to a parent. Sandra came back out with hot chocolate and a plate of eggs Jeffrey hadn't ordered but always got. She set them down, left. The bell above the door rang at 7:41. Jeffrey looked up habit. She came in from the October cold, moving through the narrow gap between the hostess stand and the first booth. With the fluid efficiency something had been guiding the width of doorways and the placement of furniture for long enough that she'd stopped doing it consciously. The wheelchair was manual, dark blue, and looked like something prescribed rather than purchased off a shelf. Custom geometry, lightweight frame, the kind that cost more than most people's laptops and was worth every cent. She wore a blazer the color of deep water, navy or maybe a very dark teal in the diner light over a white shirt. Small silver earrings. Her dark hair was pulled back with a single clip in the way of someone who'd accomplished this in under 90 seconds and didn't need it to be prettier than functional. Her face was sharp-angled, precise, the kind of face that defaulted to attention rather than expression, taking in the room without appearing to, cataloging and discarding. She chose the table by the window. Not the one nearest the accessible entrance, the one with the best light. I had her laptop open before Sandra reached her. Jeffrey took in the weight of the bag over her left shoulder. Heavy enough that most people would have shifted it by now, redistributed the load. She hadn't. She registered it as a factor and compensated without making it a production. He returned to his notebook. Owen said without looking up from the hypothetical creature.
What does impractical mean? More than is useful. Is 47 teeth impractical? For what purpose? Owen thought about it. General purposes, probably. I'm scaling back to 32. Owen erased something, like humans, but with intent.
The bell rang again at 7:49. 3 men. Jeffrey clocked them before the door was fully open. They came in as a group, which meant they'd arrived together, which meant the entrance was coordinated, even if that coordination was unconscious. You didn't enter a diner as a unit unless you were operating as one. Expensive clothes. Not the settled expensive of people who'd had money long enough to know how it fit. The aspirational expensive of people who'd acquired it recently and were still making announcements about it. Too tall, broad across the shoulders. One shorter, thicker through the chest, compensating for the height differential in the way that shorter men in the company of physically larger men sometimes did. By being the one who talked first, laughed loudest, occupied the most verbal real estate. They took the center table, not a booth. The table that put them in the middle of the room with maximum acoustic range. Jeffrey noted the silver watch on the taller one's wrist. Noted that all three sat with their backs to the door, which told him either they'd never been trained to care or they'd never been anywhere that required caring. Noted the way the shorter one scanned the room after sitting, not checking for threats, performing the scan, looking for an audience. Their voices came down immediately, not loud arguing loud. Not drunk loud. The specific loud of men who had never once in their lives been in a room where keeping their voices down was required. Sandra went to their table. Her face did the thing it did when she was managing her expression, professionally pleasant. The kind of pleasant that took work and left no trace of the work. She took their order. Left. Jeffrey returned to the invoice. He got approximately 4 minutes. Then the man with the silver watch stood up. He walked to the window table. Slow, not aggressive slow, certain slow. The kind of walk that announced a decision had already been made. Jeffrey tracked the movement in his peripheral vision without turning his head. The woman at the window table hadn't looked up from her screen. She had no reason to expect someone was coming toward her. This was a diner. People sat and ate. The man stopped beside her table, said nothing immediately. She just stood there, close enough that his presence demanded acknowledgement. She looked up. The man's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. You're blocking the walkway. She looked around herself, at the table, at the space between her and the window, at the clearly unobstructed aisle 3 feet to the man's left. Her voice was even, controlled in the way that control took maintenance. I don't think I am, the walkway. He gestured broadly, vaguely. It's too tight. The second tall man was standing now. Jeffrey hadn't tracked him move, which was unusual. He'd been watching the woman's face, watching the shift in her expression as she processed what was happening. The specific realignment of someone recognizing a familiar architecture of bad intent, and he'd missed the second man's movement. He filed that. Corrected. The woman set her hands flat on the table, either side of the keyboard. This is a public dining area. I have the right to take this table as anyone. The shorter man still seated, still performing for his companions. Sure, but you're taking up more than your share. A smile wasn't meant to be friendly. Doesn't seem balanced. Nobody in the diner said anything. The farmers in the front corner had paused their argument. The couple near the door had found something urgent on their phones. Sandra was behind the counter with the carafe, not moving. Jeffrey understood the silence. He'd seen versions of it in other places, under other conditions. It wasn't cowardice, exactly. It was the math that happened automatically when a room full of people calculated whether the cost of involvement exceeded the cost of watching. When the social arithmetic didn't favor the person being targeted, he understood it. He slid out of the booth. Owen, quiet. Stay here. Owen looked up, read his father's face, looked back, wetched without asking questions. Jeffrey crossed the room, not fast, not slow. 4 steps in from the booth, he could see what he needed to see. The shorter man's left foot, the angle of it, the way it had moved when the theater of standing began. He could see the wheel of the woman's chair from here, the left side, the tilt that shouldn't have been there.
He stopped 4 feet from the 2 standing men, close enough to record processing, not close enough to provide an excuse. Problem.
2 syllables, flat. The taller man, silver, watch, did the calculation, ran the numbers. Jeffrey was 2 inches taller, broader through the shoulder, and standing with the specific stillness of someone who had not needed to adopt a physical posture to signal readiness, because readiness was simply the default state. The calculation took longer than it should have. This doesn't involve you. Silver watch. Conversational. The walkway is over there, Jeffrey pointed. To the left where the clear path ran from the door to the counter with nothing in it. That table isn't blocking anything, a beat of nothing, like I said. He looked directly at the shorter man, still seated, still smiling. The smile stopped. I'm having breakfast with my son. What's happening to this woman is my business because I'm making it my business. That's how that works. He looked back at Silver Watch, held the look without effort. You should sit down. The moment stretched. Jeffrey had been in enough situations to understand what the next few seconds would determine. Men whose confidence was constructed from the accumulated experience of never encountering genuine resistance. They were brittle in a specific way. Their authority required an audience that agreed to the terms. Remove the agreement, and there was nothing to push against. They were standing in open water. Silver Watch looked around the room. The farmers were watching, openly now. Sandra had set the carafe on the counter. The couple near the door had put their phones face down. Silver Watch sat down. The second man sat. The shorter man looked like he had something else to say. Jeffrey watched him make the calculation, watched him read the room, watched him decide against it. Jeffrey stayed standing for 3 seconds. Then he turned, and then he saw the wheel. Up close, at this angle, in this light, the left wheel of the chair was wrong. The axle housing was angled inward in a way that didn't happen from where? It happened from force. Specific, deliberate force applied to the quick-release mechanism while she'd been looking at her screen, and 3 men had been providing theatrical cover. His jaw tightened once. He crouched down to the level of the chair, not standing over her, eye level, or close enough. Looking at the wheel, not at her. "Can I look at that?" She looked at him. Dark eyes doing the rapid assessment. Who is this? What does he want? How long will this take to figure out? Is it worth the energy? The specific evaluation of someone who had learned to make it quickly because the world required making it constantly. "You're the mechanic, not a question. I've seen your truck." Black Ford, dent above the back wheel well, parked in front of the garage on Haw Grove. He looked up. "That's right, I live 2 streets over, on Maple." She said it without inflection, just information. Updating his understanding. "I've driven past it probably 200 times. Jeffrey Mercer. She looked at the wheel. Something moved through her face that wasn't fear and wasn't embarrassment and wasn't either of those things at all. Closer to the expression of someone who had required themselves not to react in public so many times the requirement had become automatic. The face you wore when you were running on override. Vivienne Hartwell. She tilted her head toward the back. "Front pocket, I carry a basic kit." He almost asked why. He already knew why. You carried your own tools when you'd learned not to wait for other people to have what you need. He unzipped the front pocket of the laptop bag. Inside, rolled into a canvas sleeve, adjustable wrench, flathead and Phillips, hex keys, a compact ratchet set. Organized to the point tool had a specific pocket, a specific position. The kind of organization that came from using a kit in the field, not just owning one. Good kit. He said it without intending to, just registered and reported. I know. He went to work. The quick-release mechanism had been torqued past its operational range. Not hugely. The person who'd done it had known enough not to make it obvious from distance, but enough. Enough to create lateral stress on the axle that would get progressively worse with use. Enough to make the chair pull unpredictably under load. Enough to become dangerous at any real speed. He worked quietly. He was good at working quietly. After a while, she said, without looking up from her screen, "You don't have to do this. I know." He didn't look up either. "I want to." She considered that, accepted it with a small economical nod. He got the mechanism back to functional. Not perfect. He didn't have what he needed for perfect here. Didn't have the right tools to true the wheel properly or replace the stressed axle housing. But functional. She could get through the day. "The axle also needs replacing," he said. The wheel I can do properly in the shop." "This'll hold. I have a board call at 9. This'll hold longer than that." He put the tools back in the canvas roll, zipped the pocket, stood up. "Bring it by the garage when you can," he said. "I'll fix it right." No charge. She looked at him with the same assessing directness she'd used before, recalibrating. "I can pay. I know you can." "Then why?" "Because she should have done something 15 minutes ago and nobody did." He said it matter-of-factly, not an accusation, just an accounting of events. "I'm not doing it for payment." A short silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable. "Why are you doing it?" Not suspicious. More like someone who had developed the habit of understanding motivations before accepting anything at face value. He thought about the answers. Actually thought about it, not the polite version. "Because I couldn't not." He looked at her. "That's the whole answer." He went back to his booth. Owen had finished the hypothetical creature and was now drawing something that appeared to be an underwater city, populated by what Jeffrey could only describe as aggressively architectural fish. He did not comment on this. He picked up his coffee. It had gone. Who was that? Owen, without looking up, named the lady with glance toward the window table, reconsidered his phrasing, landed on the chair. "Yeah. Is she okay?" Jeffrey drank his cold coffee. Looked at the window table, where Vivienne Hartwell had already returned her attention to her screen, her posture straight, her face composed, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred in the last 20 minutes of her morning. She will be, he said. They left at 8:12. The drive to Owen's school took 7 minutes. Owen spent 4 of them explaining a theory about why deep-sea fish had evolved toward bioluminescence, which he pronounced with the careful emphasis of a person who had looked up a word and intended to use it correctly. 2 minutes on whether the fish city would have laws. 1 minute of silence, then did those guys know her? Jeffrey kept his eyes on the road. I don't think so. Were they doing it on purpose? He thought about the shorter man's foot, the specific angle of it, the way the theatrical standing had provided cover for something that required about 15 seconds to accomplish and required knowing where to press. Yes, Owen looked out the window. Processed this the way he processed most things, completely at his own pace, without asking for reassurance. Then, that's bad, yeah, it is. Are you going to do something about it? Jeffrey pulled up to the school drop-off lane. Already did something, I mean more. He looked at his son, 8 years old, gap-toothed, one new incisor growing in slightly crooked hair that did whatever it wanted despite every attempt at intervention. Owen looked back at him with Rebecca's eyes, the same particular brown, the same quality of attention that didn't let you look away from a question. I don't know yet, Jeffrey said. Probably. Owen has bracked out's backpack. Don't forget the morn. Look back once, want. I won't forgive us on the left side of. I know where I put it, Owen. Just checking. He closed the door and walked toward the school entrance without looking back, which was a recent development. 6 months ago, he'd looked back twice. Jeffrey had never mentioned noticing. He just noticed. The garage was 2 minutes from the school. He unlocked the bay door at 8:31, and the morning light came through at low flat angle it would only have for another few weeks before winter changed the geometry entirely. He stood in the open door for a moment and let the light and the cold air come in together. The job board had 4 items. The Harmon brake job was complete. The Waverly transmission diagnostic was waiting on a call to the parts distributor before 10. A new inquiry from someone named Felicity Park about an exhaust system replacement. He'd need to see the car before quoting. And an oil change for the Delacroix family's van, the 3rd time this year, which meant he'd be having a conversation with them soon about whether the van wanted to go on living or had made a different decision. He called the parts distributor at 9:07, ordered what he needed, made a note about Thursday, and then he sat at the small desk in the back office with a cup of coffee that best dead in the diners because he'd bought a decent machine 18 months ago and had never regretted it. And he opened his notebook. He wrote down what he'd observed. Not about the encounter that was already filed and catalogued in the part of his brain that didn't require writing, but about the wheel, about the mechanism, about the specific knowledge someone would need to apply force to exactly the right point to cause exactly that kind of damage without making it visible from across the room. That wasn't random. That wasn't a guy with a bad temper and impulse problem. That was preparation. He looked at the note. Looked at the window. Thought about the woman at the window table with her laptop and her precise kit and her composure and the thing her face had done when she understood what was happening. Not breaking, just locking down, automatic, practiced. He thought about 2 streets over, Maple Street. He'd driven down Maple Street probably 300 times in 3 years. Parked there twice, went to the hardware store, lot was full. He hadn't knocked on any of those doors. The phone rang at 9:45. He answered it. The Delacroix family, calling before he could call them, which saved him a conversation he'd been organizing. The morning moved forward in the way mornings moved forward when you let them, task to task, invoice to invoice, the satisfying small resolutions of problems that had clear solutions. The Waverly transmission was probably a solenoid pack, which was what he'd suspected from the description and which the diagnostic confirmed. Not good news, but not catastrophic news. Parts and labor around $850. The Delacroix van had made its decision about longevity, and it was not an optimistic one. At 1:07 in the afternoon, the garage bell rang. He came out from under the Waverly vehicle to find Vivienne Hartwell rolling through the open bay door on her backup chair. Simpler, older, the kind that got things done without the engineering refinement of the primary, with the laptop bag still over her left shoulder, and an expression that suggested she'd been debating whether to do this for approximately the last 3 hours. He straightened, wiped his hands on the shop rag. I was in the neighborhood. A pause and then the small, dry addition. I'm always in the neighborhood. I live here. He looked at the backup chair. The primary was still at the diner. She'd left it with him after he'd done what he could with Sandra's help transporting it. The arrangement worked out in about 45 seconds before she'd called her car and gone to her 9 o'clock call. How was the board call? She set the bag on the workbench he gestured toward. They approved the Q4 expansion. So, fine. He looked at the backup chair more closely now that she was an older model. Still functional, but the frame had the kind of micro-fatigue that came from years of being the understudy rather than the lead. He'd noticed it when they'd transferred the bag earlier, but hadn't wanted to comment. You could have sent someone else for the primary, he said. Or called, I know, but you came. I said thank you properly. She looked around the garage with the expression of someone making a thorough inventory. The organized tool wall, the parts shelving, alphabetized by category, which was not how most garage ran, the clean floor. And I wanted to. She looked at him directly when she said the last part. No performance around it, just the fact. He turned back to the Waverly. I'll get the primary. It's in the back. He went and brought it out, set it on the floor of the open bay, crouched down. It'll need the proper axle, like I said. I've got the part coming Thursday. I ordered it this morning. She looked at the chair, then at him. You ordered it this morning? Before I called. Before you came by, yeah. A short chance silence. You expected me to come. Figured you might. He began checking the wheel alignment. Not because he hadn't checked it this morning, but because he wanted to see what the hours of the morning had done to it. Whether the temporary adjustment had held, it had. You had questions. Easier to ask them in person. She settled onto the shop stool he'd pulled out. Not the folding chair, the proper stool, the one he used when he was waiting on parts. She opened the laptop on her knees. Questions, she repeated, like she was testing the word. About the wheel, he said, and about whether it was the first time. The sound of the garage around them, the faint traffic from Hargrove Street, the radio in that back office playing something he'd stopped consciously hearing an hour ago. She looked at the screen, not reading, just having a place to look. Second time, she said. The first was 6 weeks ago. Just the quick thought the mechanism had worn out. I've had the chair 4 years. I had it serviced. The technician said there was nothing wrong with the mechanism. Jeffrey said nothing. Let that sit. Which means either the technician missed something or someone reset it between when I reported the problem and when it was serviced. She looked at him then. Direct, steady. I didn't think too hard about which one it was, but you thought about it. I thought about it. He went back to the wheel. There was a micro fracture in the axle housing that he'd missed this morning. Too small to see in the diner light, visible now under the work light, not structural yet. Would be given enough use. Someone with knowledge, he said, to do it twice without leaving obvious damage. Yes. And the morning at the diner, those weren't strangers who had a problem with you specifically. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been receiving acquisition correspondence since July. A company called Aldrich Development. They want the property corridor on Maple and Hargrove, something commercial, probably mixed use. My house is on Maple. She paused. So is most of what matters for the project to be viable. He looked up from the wheel. Their representative, someone named Slade Coleman, sent a very professional first letter, then a less professional second one. Then, 2 weeks after I declined to to the second one, an inspector from something called the Harlow County Office of Commercial Standards arrived and cited violations in the accessible modifications I made to my house. Her voice stayed even. Her hands resting on the keyboard did not. The modifications that cost me $60,000 and that my contractor, who has built in this county for 22 years, says are manufactured violations. Jeffrey set down the tool he'd been holding. The office, he said, Office of Commercial Standards. Established by county administrative order 8 months ago, she looked at him. I looked it up. It's real. The authority is real. The violations may or may not be real, but contesting them is slow and expensive, and my attorney tells me they had to pass the inspections, regardless of whether the findings are genuine. He thought about the letter in the drawer of his desk in the back office. The one that had come Monday, the one he'd put there and gone back to work. I got a letter, he said, Monday, same office. She didn't react visibly. Just absorbed it. 3 violations, waste disposal documentation, fire suppression in Bay 2. And he said it without expression, inadequate pedestrian accessibility at the public-facing entrance. The entrance with no steps and 6 feet of flat concrete. That one. For the first time, something crossed her face that was almost a smile. Almost. The way a smile looked when the situation it was responding to wasn't actually funny, but the absurdity of it registered anyway. Creative, she said. That was the word I used. He handed her the chair. She made the transfer from the stool without asking for anything. The practiced movement of someone for whom this was simply a physical requirement of their life. She pushed the chair back and forth, once, testing the adjustment. That's right, she said quietly. Real. Axial Thursday, we'll be true once we do the full replacement. He looked at her. You should file a report about this morning, about the chair, with the police. With the police. She held his gaze. You think they're connected? I think, he said carefully, that someone who wanted you to feel unwelcome in that neighborhood, who wanted your daily life harder and more uncertain, would do exactly what those men did this morning. He paused. I don't have more than that yet. A long silence. Hargrove Street, outside, the radio. I'll file the report, she said. Good. He stepped back. And if anything else happens, anything that feels like it's not coincidence. He looked at her. I'm 2 streets over. She looked at him for a moment. The full attention look. The same one she'd used in the diner when she'd been deciding how much to trust the next thing that was about to happen to her. Slower now, more complete. Birch Street, she said. Number 18, black truck. She nodded. Not thank you exactly, or not just thank you. Something more balanced, someone who had learned to accept genuine help without either inflating it or dismissing it. Then she was through the bay door and moving up Hargrove Street in the October afternoon light, the backup chair moving with the efficiency of someone who had gotten very good at making second-best options work. He watched her go until she reached the corner and turned. Then he went back to the Waverly transmission. He called the parts distributor again at 3:40 to confirm Thursday delivery. Picked up Owen at 3:15 from football practice, which had predictably run until 3:14, drove home. Made dinner that was technically food and nutritionally adequate, and that Owen ate without complaint, because Owen had the useful characteristic of not requiring dinner to be exciting, only to be there. After homework and the battle over bedtime and the eventual agreement that 8:45 was not, in fact, an oppressive hour to expect an 8-year-old to be in bed, Jeffrey sat at the kitchen in the quiet house. He opened the notebook. He wrote down what he knew. Not speculation, what he actually knew. The violations letter, dated Monday. The Office of Commercial Standards, which he'd looked up after getting the letter, and which had been established by County Administrative Order 8 months ago, and appeared to have been dormant until approximately 3 months prior. The acquisition correspondence Vivienne had mentioned, the timeline she'd described, letter in July, saying declined letter, inspector in August, 1 month, between her decline and the first vice president's notice. He drew a line. He wrote, Aldrich Development. He looked up the company. It took about 4 minutes to find what he was looking for. The corporate filings were public record. The principal registered agent named on the documents was a man named Warren Aldrich, and the Aldrich Development website had the kind of professional photography and mission statement language that suggested a company that wanted to look larger and older than it was. Warren Aldrich, 58, from the profile photo on the company's about page. Silver-haired, good suit, the settled confidence of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms for long enough that they'd stopped checking. Jeffrey looked at the photo for a while. Then he looked at the timeline again. Acquisition letter beginning in July. Her refusal, violations in August. His violations letter Monday. He turned to a fresh page. Wrote at the top, what I don't know yet. Below it in a column, who established the Commercial Standards Office and why. Connection between Aldrich and County Admin. Whether men at the time today were contracted or incidental. Whether the wheel damage is the second incident or the third. He stopped at the 4th point. Read it back. Second or third, because a pattern of 2 was already a pattern. And patterns didn't usually announce themselves at the second iteration. They announced themselves when someone looked backward from the 3rd, 4th, and understood what had been happening since the first. He closed the notebook, sat in the kitchen in the dark for a minute. The house settling around him, the particular sounds of an old house doing what old houses did, contracting against the October cold, the floorboard near Owen's room that creaked in a specific way when the temperature dropped below 40. He thought about the blue house on Maple Street. He'd driven down that street 300 times in 3 years. He'd never thought about who lived in it. He thought about the way she'd said second time and how she'd said it without particular inflection, like it was just information. Like she had gotten very good at narrating facts about her own life that would have made other people's voices crack. He thought about the man with the silver watch and the specific knowledge required to damage a wheelchair mechanism without obvious evidence, and whether those two things were related, and whether the letter on his desk was the beginning of something or the middle of it. He got up, rinsed his mug, checked Owen's door, closed, small strip of light under it already dark, the creak of the floorboard when he stepped close enough to check telling him Owen had been asleep for at least an hour. He went to bed, lay in the dark. The wind was picking up outside, and the maple in Bullied was losing the last of its leaves against the window in small irregular percussion. He thought about Thursday, about the axle, about a garage and a woman's house on adjacent streets and violation letters with the same font from an office that hadn't existed a year ago. He thought about the moment in the diner when the room went quiet. The moment when everyone calculated and the math didn't favor anyone getting involved. He thought about the fact that the math was wrong. Not strategically wrong, not tactically wrong, just wrong. Some things weren't math. He closed his eyes. The maple kept at the window. Tomorrow he'd call his accountant. Find out if Dale Pruitt had gotten a letter too. Start putting the shape of things together before he could see the whole shape. One thing at a time, that was the only way to do this right. He was asleep by 11. Outside Clover Hill went about its business. The diner closed at 9. The hardware store had its lights off by 8:30. On Maple Street, the blue house was lit on the first floor, the faint glow of a monitor visible through the front window. Someone still working, still at it, keeping whatever hours the work required. 2 streets over on Birch, the black Ford with the dented wheel sat in the driveway. The garage was locked, the notebook was closed, the morning would come, and the things that needed to be figured out would still be there waiting when it did. The letter from Dale Pruitt came in the form of a phone call at 9:22 Tuesday morning. And the first thing Dale said before hello was, "You got one too." Jeffrey had the Harmon brake job receipt spread across the desk and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He closed the receipt folder. What kind? Commercials? Standards? Sant shop on the corner, Nora Betts, you know her? Red awning makes the turkey clubs. A pause that had something particular in it. The pause of a man who had done the arithmetic and didn't like the sum. She got hers 2 weeks ago. Different violations, same office, same font on the letterhead. She'd turned down an acquisition offer 10 days before it arrived. Jeffrey looked at the violation letter on his desk. He'd moved it from the drawer to the desk surface that morning because he'd decided looking at it occasionally was better than pretending it wasn't there. Acquisition from Aldrich Development. You already know about them. I'm learning. Dale cleared his throat. The office. I looked it up more carefully than I did the first time around, when I figured it was just bureaucratic noise. County administrative order, 8 months old, and here's what's interesting. The order was signed by Gerald Harp, Commissioner Harp, who sits on the County Land Use Board and has for 9 years. Another pause. The Aldrich Development corporate filings list Gerald Harp as having attended 2 of their advisory board meetings in the last 3 years. Different Gerald Harp, theoretically. Could be a coincidence. Could be. Sure. Dale's voice had the specific dryness of a man who had been doing work long enough to understand that coincidences in paperwork were rarely accidental. You thinking about getting ahead of this or letting it ride? Getting ahead of it. Jeffrey picked up a pen. I need an attorney. Someone who handles administrative disputes and property law and who doesn't have any particular relationship with anyone in this county. That's a specific ask. I have a specific problem. Dale thought for a moment. Frances Whitmore. She's out of Roanoke, civil and administrative law, 30-some years, and as far as I know, she's never worked a case in Hall County specifically. Cheap, and she doesn't tell you what you want to hear. Jeffrey wrote the name down. That's what I need. He hung up and sat with the name for a minute. Outside on Hargrove Street, a delivery truck went past too fast for the posted limit, which it always did, because the posted limit on Hargrove had always been optimistic. He could hear Owen's voice in the back of his head from that morning, asking whether the Fish City would have speed limits, and whether the fish would obey them. Probably not, Jeffrey had said. Owen had nodded like this confirmed a theory. He called Frances Whitmore at 9:47. She answered herself, which surprised him. He'd expected an assistant, a machine. She answered her professional installation. She answered on the third ring with her name, last name first, the way doctors and lawyers answered when they were still in the habit of being available. He gave her the short version, the violation letter, the timeline, the acquisition offer he hadn't received yet but suspected was coming given what Vivian had described. The connection to the diner incident which he explained without editorializing, the commercial standards offids and the Gerald Harp question. Francis Whitmore listened without interrupting for 4.5 minutes. He knew because he was looking at the clock on the wall, the cheap analog one he'd bought at a hardware store because digital clocks in garages feel like he was in an operating room. When he finished, she said, "There's a woman on Maple Street." Vivian Hartwell. "She's already in this. She is. Have you spoken to her about getting coordinated legal representation? One attorney working across both situations." "Not yet. Talk to her today." Francis's voice had the quality of someone who gave directions without wondering whether they'd be followed. "And send me everything you have. The letter, photographs of the envelope, the date you received it, and whatever documentation you have of the previous interaction at the diner. Police report if there is one. She filed one. I'll get you a copy. One more thing, Jeffrey." A pause that was different from Dale's pause, less arithmetic, more assessment. "Don't contact Aldrich Development directly. Don't respond to their representatives. Don't do anything that could be characterized later as having initiated conflict. I know how people who've been trained in certain ways respond to pressure, and I need you to understand that the right response here is documentation, not confrontation." He looked at his hands on the desk. "Understood. I'll be in touch by Thursday." He drove to Maple Street at noon with the oil-stained knuckles of a man who had been under a car until 11:55 and had washed his hands twice and still felt like there was something on them. He'd called Vivienne first, not assumed. She'd said come whenever, which in the language of people who kept precise schedules meant come now if you have something to say. The blue house was exactly what the drive-past view had suggested, and nothing that the drive-past view could have communicated. From the street, it was a well-kept Victorian, narrow lot, the kind of mature landscaping that came from trees being left to grow for 30 years without being pruned into submission. Up close at the front door, you could see the things that weren't original to the house. Lever handles on the door instead of round knobs. No threshold between the porch boards and the interior floor. The transition was flush, perfectly flush. Someone had done careful work to make it so. A recessed entry with no lip, step, not even the 1/4-inch ridge that most people never thought about because they'd never had a reason to. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard the truck. "Dale Pruitt called you," she said. "Dale called me first." He stepped inside. "Then I've called Francis Whitmore." She led him toward the kitchen, which was where she went when conversations required a table, and he followed, taking in the house in the peripheral way he took in spaces. The lever handle continuing on every interior door. The hallway width broader than standard. The bookshelves at the reachable height that lined the left wall and were double stacked because she clearly bought more books than she had shelf space for and had solved this problem by fitting in another row rather than getting more shelves. The kitchen had a pull-out under the counter where a fixed cabinet would normally be, a sink at slightly lower height than standard, a coffee maker at the far end of the counter that he could see cost real money and looked like it had earned it. She poured 2 mugs without asking. Set his on the table, sat across from him. "Whitmore." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I looked her up in July when all of this started. Decided she was too aggressive. She is aggressive. I've changed my position on whether that's a problem. The table. Between them, a laptop and a stack of folders and a small succulent that had been repotted recently. The soil looked fresh, the edges of the ceramic pot still clean. He'd noticed she kept things current. Maintained them. He told her about Dale's information, the Gerald Harp connection, the advisory board meetings, the possibility that the Offices of Commercial Standards existed specifically as a mechanism for this kind of pressure and would likely be dissolved once the project completed or failed. He laid it out the way he laid out diagnostic information. Here is what we know, here is what we can infer from it, here is what the inference suggests about what we don't know yet. She listened the way she listened to everything. Fully present, no pre-processing thing visible on her face, waiting for the information to arrive completely before doing anything with it. When he was done, The violation against my house targets the accessible modifications specifically. She set down her mug. The inspector cited the ramp and lift structure, the widened doorways, and the accessible bathroom on the main floor. My contractor, Patrick Shields, built all of it. He pulled the permits correctly. He passed every inspection at the time. He has photographs from every stage of the construction. He's willing to see so. He's already said so to me in writing last month. He was angry. She looked at him. Patrick Shields is not a man who gets angry without reason. What's the remediation figure they're asking for? A pause. The specific pause of someone who had been living with a number long enough that saying it out loud had become less difficult but not painless. $80,000. If I can't successfully contest the violations. Jeffrey said nothing. He was doing his own math, and his math said that a woman running a technology company with 31 employees had $80,000. But it also said that the willingness to pay $80,000 to fix violations were fraudulent, depended on whether you believed the system that created the violations would also adjudicate them fairly. And that was a different calculation. It's a lever, he said. It's a very effective lever. She looked at the succulent. Because it's technically legal, the city has the authority to order inspections. The violation findings are technically the findings of a certified inspector. I can contest them, but the process takes months and costs money, and meanwhile the enforcement timeline runs. She looked at him, and meanwhile I'm also running a company and managing a board that doesn't know any of this is happening, because I have not told them. Why not? She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. Because I have spent 4 years building something from a position that most of my industry assumed precluded serious leadership. The moment I say the word wheelchair at a board meeting in any context other than routine business, I will spend the next 2 quarters answering questions about my capacity instead of reviewing expansion metrics. She picked up her mug. I'm not giving them that. He understood that. He didn't say he understood it, because saying it felt condescending, like announcing you'd heard something. Instead, he said, Francis thinks we should coordinate, one attorney handling both situations as a pattern rather than 2 isolated incidents. It is a pattern. That's what makes it stronger legally. 2 adjacent property owners receiving manufactured violations after independently declining acquisition offers from the same company is a demonstrable pattern. He looked at her, especially if there are others on the block who've received similar letters. Sandra Ogle. Vivian said it without hesitation. The diner. She told me in August she'd gotten something from the county about a plumbing inspection. She'd turned down a letter from Aldrich in June. She didn't connect them. A pause. Or she did connect them and decided not to say so. Sandra, who had stood behind the counter with her carafe and not said anything when 3 men stood at Vivienne's table. Who had texted Jeffrey to it when she'd seen something in the dark. Not cowardice. Not exactly. The calculation that people made when they were alone in a situation and not sure what the calculation would cost them. I'll talk to her, Jeffrey said. Vivian reached for the stack of folders. Pulled one and slid it across the table. A copy of the violation notice, the inspector's report, a letter from Patrick Shields, dated September 14th. He read through it. Shields' letter was 3 pages, technical, precise, much with photographs referenced in the appendix. The photographs showed every stage of the foundation work. The inspector's report cited specific failures in those foundations that the photographs made impossible. He's good, Jeffrey said, meaning Shields. He's meticulous, he said. And I'm quoting him exactly because I wrote it down when he said it, that for his work to have the problems the inspector cited, the concrete would have had to have been mixed incorrectly from the first pour. He says that's not possible given that he has photographic evidence of the slump test results, and the inspector was present at the pour and signed off on the documentation at the time. Who was the inspector at the pour? She already had the page, slid it across. He looked at the signature on the inspection form from 4 years ago. Different from the name on the current violation report. Different inspector entirely. The current violations inspector, she said, is named Derek Sims. I looked him up. Before his appointment to the County Commercial Standards Office 9 months ago, he worked for a private consulting firm called Bridgeway Solutions. Jeffrey looked up from the paperwork. Bridgeway Solutions has one significant long-term client relationship that I could find documented in their public filings, she said. Aldrich Development Group, 3 years. The kitchen was very quiet. You found all of this, he said. I run a data infrastructure company. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite bitterness. It was the specific tone of someone who had used a significant skill in a context where they wished the skill wasn't necessary. Finding patterns in connected data sets is what I do. Finding this one took about 6 hours over 2 evenings. He looked at the table between them, the violation letter, the Shields report, the Bridgeway Solutions connection. He looked at the line connecting them, the line she'd drawn before he'd even knocked on the door. Frances needs all of this today, he said. I know, she was already reaching for her laptop. I'll send it. He left the house at 1:30, stood on the front for a moment in the October cold before going to the truck. The neighborhood was quiet in the midday way of older residential streets. A dog somewhere, a car 2 blocks over, leaves moving. Someone's wind chimes from the porch of the house to the east. He stood there and thought about the shape of what he was looking at. A developer with county connections. An administrative office created to produce legal-looking pressure. A pattern across at least 2, probably more, property owners on this block. And a woman who had figured out most of the architecture of it herself before he'd walked into the diner on a Thursday morning. She'd been fighting this alone for 4 months. He got in the truck and drove back to the garage, the camera system he installed at his own garage 2 weeks later. 3 exterior cameras, cloud storage, motion-activated alerts to his phone, was the same system he recommended to Vivienne the following Sunday. He'd mentioned it on a Tuesday. She'd said she'd been meaning to do it, and he'd offered to help install hers while Owen was at a birthday party for a school friend. A 3-hour event at one of those indoor entertainment complexes with laser tag and pizza, and the specific chaos of 28-year-olds given foam weapons and limited adult supervision. Owen had been talking about it for 9 days. He arrived at the Blue House at 10 in the morning with the camera hardware and his bag, and the understanding that this was a practical task with a defined scope and not anything more complicated than that. She met him at the door in work clothes, not the blazer, jeans and a gray pullover, hair down, because it was Sunday and she was still working, but she was doing it in Sunday mode, which apparently existed. I made a site map, she said, handing him a printed diagram of the house exterior, with proposed camera positions marked in red. Sightline lines for coverage overlap. He looked at it. She'd accounted for blind spots he hadn't thought of yet and one he had. This is good. I had opinions about where the blind spots were. She turned toward the kitchen. Coffee's on. They worked in the way they'd found they could work, in parallel, without narrating every action, without requiring social maintenance between exchanges. He ran cable while she sat at the kitchen table managing a video call that ran 40 minutes and that he caught pieces of while working in the adjacent hallway. She was talking to someone about data migration architecture, her voice taking on the specific clipped precision of someone explaining something technical to someone who was mostly keeping up. She didn't simplify. She'd when necessary. When the call ended, she brought him coffee without asking whether he wanted it. He was on the ladder near the side gate and took it carefully with one hand. You should know, she said, standing below him with her own mug, that I looked up the camera model before you came. Found better reviews than I gave you. Found the same reviews. I just like to verify. She looked up at him. How's the sightline from that angle? He adjusted the housing, checked the preview on his phone. Good. Catches the whole gate approach. That's the one I was most concerned about. She looked at the gate. Latch, the low fence. Easy to reach over and open, I know. She looked at the gate for another moment. When I decided not to install cameras earlier, I told myself it was because of the expense. But the expense was manageable. She turned back toward the house. I didn't want to install them because installing them meant I'd accepted that someone might actually come onto my property. And I had spent a very long time trying not to accept things I couldn't control. He came down the ladder, put the camera in the bag to install last. How's that going? Not accepting things, inconsistently. She didn't say it like a complaint, more like a field report from an ongoing operation. Some days better. Some days I find myself not going to the farmer's market because the route has 2 places where the curb cut is broken and I don't feel like doing that particular math. She started back toward the kitchen door, and then I go anyway. Because the alternative is letting the broken curb cuts determine my schedule, which I refuse. So you go and you're annoyed the whole way. I go and I'm annoyed the whole way. And then I get there and Carol has heirloom butternut squash and I forget I was annoyed. She held the door. It's not a particularly heroic system. It works. Inside, she made lunch while he finished the last 2 cameras. Sandwiches assembled with the same efficiency she brought to everything. No wasted motion, every ingredient retrieved once. He came in from the last installation and washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and they ate at the table with the cameras live on his phone. All 4 angles cycling. She looked at the feed, at the side gate in particular, the angle that caught the approach, the latch visible and clear. "Tell me about Frances," she said, "what she's found so far." Gerald Harp signed the administrative order creating the Commercial Standards Office in February. She found the Harp-Aldrich Advisory Board connection you already knew about and 3 additional interactions. 2 county land use decisions in the past 2 years where Harp voted to expedite permits for Aldrich projects, and 1 zoning variance that went through in 18 days when the average processing time for that variance category is 4 months. She ate her sandwich, 18 days. Frances called it the most interesting number she'd seen in the file. What does she want to do with it? Build the case that the Commercial Standards Office is a tool rather than a legitimate regulatory body. That requires demonstrating a pattern across enough properties that it can't be explained as coincidence. She's got you, she's got me, she's got Nora Betts at the sandwich shop. She's trying to reach 2 other owners on the block who may have received letters and hasn't confirmed either way. There's also Marcus Devlin, Vivian said. He looked at her, the man from the diner, the shorter one. She picked up her coffee. "I looked up Aldrich Development corporate filings after you mentioned Bridgeway Solutions. Marcus Devlin is listed as a logistics coordinator for Aldrich in their last 2 annual reports. He's not a contractor they brought in for this. He's staff." The sentence settled between them. "He knew your third-stage schedule," Jeffrey said. "I've had breakfast at Millstone every Thursday for 2 years. I'm not subtle about it." She said it without self-recrimination, just fact. Anyone who wanted to where I'd be at 7:45 on a Thursday morning would have found out in 1 conversation with anyone in a 2-block radius. Which means it was targeted, which means all of it was targeted. She set down the mug. "I've been telling myself for 4 months that the violation letters were aggressive, but that whoever was doing this was staying just inside the lines." She looked at the camera feed on his phone. "Someone coming into my yard at night is not inside any line." "No, it isn't." She's quiet for a moment. The kitchen around them, the herbs in the window box, the good coffee maker, the books stacked on the counter because she'd run out of shelf space in the office and hadn't yet decided where to put another shelf. Evidence of a life built deliberately, piece by piece, in a specific place. "I hate this," she said, quiet, matter of fact. Not asking for anything in response, just naming it. Yeah, he picked up his sandwich. "I know, the cameras went live that afternoon." He showed her the monitoring app, the alert settings, the way to check the cloud archive. She learned it in the way she learned everything, completely in 1 pass, without needing it repeated. He was in the truck by 3:15 to get Owen from the birthday party, which had apparently run long because when he pulled up, Owen emerged with the specific glazed expression of a child who had played laser tag for 2.5 hours and eaten 3 pieces of pizza and was now operating approximately 15% below standard. "Who won?" Jeffrey asked. "Team Owen got in the truck." "But Marcus cheated." "What kind of cheating?" "The kind where you stand too still and then shoot people when they walk around a corner." Owen considered this. "That's actually strategy I'm re-evaluating." They drove home. Jeffrey made dinner. Owen did homework with the focused grumpiness of someone whose brain was still partially laser tagging. They argued briefly about whether 9 o'clock was a reasonable bedtime on a Sunday when there was school tomorrow, and Owen's position that the question of what was reasonable depended one's of knowledge to the week ahead, was well-reasoned enough that Jeffrey acknowledged the argument even while not changing the outcome. After Owen was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, turned to the page where he'd written his list of what he didn't know yet. He crossed off 2 items, added 3. At the bottom of the page he wrote, Brian Calloway. He'd been thinking about the name for a week. Brian Calloway was the Harlow County Sheriff, which meant he was an elected official, which meant he had relationships with county commissioners and land use board members, which meant he was embedded in the same institutional landscape that had produced the Commercial Standards Office and Gerald Harp's convenient voting record. Whether that meant he was part of the problem or just adjacent to it was a question Jeffrey hadn't answered. Vivienne had mentioned once, in passing, that she'd known Calloway in high school. Not close friends, not strangers either. He looked at the name for a while. Then he closed the notebook and went to bed. He was under the Felicity Park exhaust system Wednesday morning when his phone buzzed with a message from Vivienne. Calloway just left. He came to the house. We'll explain when you can talk. He finished the weld he was working on because stopping mid-weld was worse than finishing. Then slid out and called her. She answered without preamble. He came in civilian clothes, 6:30 in the evening after business hours. She was concise in the way she was always concise. Information delivered in the most efficient order. He said he'd been meaning to check in since he'd heard there were inspections on the block. But what he actually did was tell me something specific and then ask me not to repeat it in a way that made it clear he was speaking as Brian Calloway, the person, rather than the county sheriff. Jeffrey wiped his hands. What did he tell you? He's been reviewing older case files as part of a quarterly administrative process. He pulled the accident report from 4 years ago. Route 11 and Crawford Avenue, November 17th. A pause. The kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty but was the necessary space between one thing and the next. That's my accident, he said. Nothing. Let her have the space. The report lists 3 witnesses. 2 gave statements. The third is logged as contacted. No statement provided. Normal. But in the original evidence intake document, which is a separate form completed by a different officer, there are 4 names. The 4th name appears nowhere else in the file. Not as contacted, not as declined. Just gone. Jeffrey said, Pete Sanger. He was a private electrician at the time. He was parked at the gas station on the corner when the accident happened. Her voice stayed steady, which he understood by now meant the steadiness was doing work. Calloway found him and Roke. Different job now. He didn't want to talk at first. But he talked. Jeffrey was standing in the middle of the garage bay with the exhaust work half finished behind him and a rag in his hand he'd forgotten to put down. The afternoon light came through the bay door in the flat October way it did. He saw the driver of the at-fault vehicle exit from the driver's side before the ambulances arrived. She said it evenly. He said the man was unsteady, that his eyes were wrong, that there was a smell he recognized. A beat. He approached the man, asked if he was all right. The man, the driver, said to him, please don't say anything. Jeffrey put the rag on the workbench. 15 minutes later, a man in a suit arrived at the scene before any official documentation had been completed. He spoke with Pisanger separately, told him that witnesses who made inaccurate statements about accident scenes could face legal exposure. Told him his statement wasn't necessary, told him the situation was being handled, and Pete Sanger was 20-something with a new business attorney. He was. He stayed quiet. He moved to Roanoke 8 months later. She said the next part with the precision of someone who had been holding this sentence for several hours. Calloway says Pete Sanger told him the driver's name was Theo Aldrich. The word Aldrich landed in the garage like something with weight, the same way a diagnostic result lands when you've suspected it and hoping you were wrong and you weren't. Jeffrey stood very still. He was 24 at the time, Vivienne continued. The blood alcohol test was administered at the hospital 2 hours and 40 minutes after the accident. The result was below the threshold for criminal charges. He was cited for running a red light. The case was closed. 2 hours and 40 minutes. He did the arithmetic automatically, the way you do when you know what the numbers mean. The metabolism rate of blood alcohol. What 2 hours and 40 minutes of additional processing time meant for a reading that ended up just under the line. Someone waited, he said. That's what it looks like. Her voice still even, doing what it needed to do. The lawyer who arrived before the police. The witness who disappeared from the report. The test administered with sufficient delay. She stopped for a moment, then I signed some civils 14 months after the accident in the rehabilitation facility. Was told the evidence didn't support criminal liability. I was told the blood alcohol result was definitive. And you trusted the process. I was 30 years old and learning to use a wheelchair, and someone handed me a document and told me what it said. She said it without anger, without self-pity, with the flat clarity of someone who had been looking at an object from one angle for 4 years and had just been handed a light that revealed a different side. I trusted the process because I had nothing else to trust. He sat down on the stool by the workbench. Looked at the half-finished exhaust job, the car, the work, the invoices on the desk, The ordinary machinery of a Wednesday afternoon that had just acquired a different meaning because the shape of what he was in the middle of had just changed. Calloway told you this off the record, he said. He said he doesn't know how deep the Aldrich family's connections run in this county. He said that he doesn't know which of his colleagues have had conversations he hasn't been told about. He said he's telling me privately because I'm already in it, whether I chose to be. A pause. And because he's been trying to locate Pete Sanger officially, and he's worried that if he looks too hard through official channels, someone will hear about it before he gets there. Jeffrey understood that. The specific problem of operating within a system when you weren't sure whose hands were on what parts of the mechanism. He wants a soterized statement from Sanger, Vivian said. He won't get it quickly through an official request if Aldrich has reach into the county system. No. She was quiet for a moment. But Stephen Wald might. He didn't know the name yet. He's a reporter, she said. Virginia State Tribune. He called me 3 weeks ago. I didn't return the call because I didn't know what I was dealing with yet. He covers regional development and land use issues. Francis mentioned him to me yesterday as someone who had been looking at Aldrich Development's activity across multiple counties. You think he's already building something. I think a man who covers regional development for a state-level paper and calls me specifically, unprompted, about a property on my block. Yes. I think he's already building something. A beat. Francis thinks I should call him back. What do you think? She took her time with that. He appreciated that she took her time, that she didn't perform certainty she didn't have. I think information has a direction. Once I tell Stephen Wald what I know, I can't undo that. I'm not sure what direction it goes in. Another pause. But I'm also aware that I've been sitting on what I know for 4 months and the situation has not improved by my sitting on it. He looked out the open bay door, Hargrove Street, the ordinary afternoon. Call Wald, he said. But talk to Francis first about what to tell him and what to hold. That's what I was going to do. He almost laughed. Not at her, at the rhythm of their conversations which had developed in the way of conversations between two people who arrived at the same conclusions from different directions. I know. The second camera alert came at 11:52 that same night. He was asleep. Or almost. The specific stage of not quite sleep where the body had given in but the mind was still filing things. His phone on the nightstand lit up with the passion alert from camera 3. The side gate camera. He was sitting up and reading the timestamp before he'd made a conscious decision to be. Camera 3, 11:52 p.m. Motion. He opened the app. The recorded clip was 22 seconds. A figure approaching the side gate from the street. Reaching over the latch, pushing through, moving along the side of the house. Then moving back. Gone. His hands were already on the phone dialing before the clip ended. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. You saw it, she said. Just now, where are you? Kitchen, I heard something. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then the alert. Her voice was controlled in the specific way that controlled voices sound when the control is the product of significant effort. I haven't been outside yet. Don't go outside. He was already out of bed, jeans from the chair, jacket from the hook. I'm coming. 10 minutes. He checked on Owen. Deeply asleep, arm trailing off the edge of the mattress, no awareness of the world beyond his own dreams. He wrote a note and put it on Owen's nightstand in the specific position where Owen would see it immediately upon waking. Went to neighbors back before you're up. Do not leave the house. Call me when you wake. He'd done this twice before, both garage emergencies. Owen understood the protocol. He drove the 2 blocks in minutes, not fast, measured. The front light at the blue house was on. He knocked. She opened the door in a gray pullover and jeans, hair loose, no blazer. Nothing prepared. Just a person who had been awake in her own house when something had entered the perimeter. She looked at him. Then she moved back to let him in. The primary wheelchair, the good one, the one he had repaired, was against the wall of the living room. Wrong angle, not you left a chair you were going to use. Next. He went to it without asking. Crouched, looked. The rear frame joint on the right side was stressed at the connection point in a way that had required sustained force applied in a specific direction. Not a kick, not an impact, pressure. Deliberate pressure held long enough to stress the weld, and the seat cushion, custom-fitted, medical-grade foam inside a specific cover, had been cut along the bottom seam, not visible from the top. A cut designed to make the cushion fail gradually, unpredictably, in a way that would become apparent only after she'd been using it for some time. He didn't touch anything. We photographed this first, he said. All of it. You know the chair. You document what's wrong. She already had her phone out. Bull. She moved around the chair with a steadiness that he registered with something that was complicated to name. It was respect, but it was also something that recognized the cost of that steadiness, the amount of ongoing work it represented. Bull. She photographed every angle, every point of damage, with the systematic attention of someone who had been documenting things carefully for months and knew exactly what mattered. Bull. After, he called the non-emergency line. The officer who came was young Patterson, the name on his shirt, the kind of officer whose uniforms still had the fresh-pressed quality, almost who hadn't been in it long enough to stop thinking about how it looked. He was thorough, though. He wrote down everything. Bull. He photographed the chair, the gate, the exterior of the house along the path the figure had taken. Bull. He wrote down what Jeffrey told him about the prior diner incident, the violation letters, the Aldrich development connection. His expression was usual in the trained way of officers who had been taught to be neutral and not the natural way of people who were. After Patterson left, she made coffee. It was 1:40 a.m. Neither of them were going back to sleep immediately, and they both knew it. She pushed a mug across the table to him. Sat down. "The gate," she said. "Simple latch, no lock. You can reach it from outside. I've always known that." Looked at her hands. "I made a choice years ago not to lock everything, not to turn the house into something I had to navigate defensively. I wanted it to be a home, not a fortified position." She looked up. "Well, that's probably naive. It's not naive." He picked up the mug. "It's a reasonable thing that became unreasonable because someone's to might get hate, so that's their problem, not a failure of your judge." She was quiet, looking at the table. "What they cut," he said carefully. "The cushion. That's medical equipment. I know, that's not a warning. That's not intimidation." Someone who cuts the seat cushion so it fails gradually wants you to lose control of the chair at speed without knowing why. He held her gaze. That's a different category of action than a letter. The kitchen was very still. "They're scared," she said. "That's what this means. They were making legal pressure and it wasn't working fast enough, and now they're scared." She said it without satisfaction, as analysis is, which means something shifted. Either they know we're building something or they think we're about to. Or they've done this before and they know this is when targets either break or escalate. She nodded once. "Which are we doing?" "Escalating," he said carefully. She looked at him for a moment. Then, with the small and specific quality of someone making a decision that had been forming for some time, "I want to meet Stephen Wald. I'll tell Francis. And I want to talk to Calloway again." Officially this time, on the record, everything, the letters, the chair, all of it. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "If Calloway is who he seemed to be when he came here, he needs more to work with. And if he's not who he seemed to be, then I need to know that too." He looked at her. The kitchen light, the chair against the wall in the living room, the cut along the cushion seam that no one would see from the outside. "There's something else," he said. She waited. The figure in the camera. I've watched the cooler 4 times on the drive over. The way they moved through the gate, the angle of approach, the speed, someone who had been on that property before, or had studied it. He paused. Not a hired intimidation, someone who knew the layout. She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not fear, not yet, but the precursor to recognition. The look of someone following a line of reasoning toward a conclusion they hadn't gotten to yet. "How long do you need to look at the footage?" she asked. "I already have it on my phone, clean copy cloud archived. I'll go through the whole week when I get home." He stood up. "I'll call you tomorrow." She looked at the table, then Jeffrey. He stopped. "Nobody does this." She said it precisely, without ceremony. The way she said things, she meant exactly. For someone they've known for 3 mean nobody does this. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I know what you're going to say. I'm not going to say thank you. I already said thank you." She looked at him. "I'm going to say that I notice when something is genuine and I don't say so often enough." He held the jacket, looked at her. The specific look of 2 people at 2 in the morning when the performance that daylight required had worn entirely off and what was left was just what was actually there. "Get some sleep," he said. "What you can." He drove home in the dark, parked in the driveway. Sat in the truck for 2 minutes with his phone, going through the camera footage frame by frame. At the 09 timestamp, the figure turned their head. Not all the way, not enough to be clearly identified in the available light, but enough to see the profile, the particular angle of a jaw, the height relative to the fence line. The way the left shoulder carried slightly higher than the right. in the specific asymmetric posture of someone who had done repetitive work with their right hand long enough that the left compensated. He sat with the frame for a long time. Then he went inside, put the note from Owen's nightstand in his jacket pocket, sat at the kitchen table. He opened the notebook, turned to a fresh page, wrote at the top, "What I think I know," not yet confirmed. Below it, one line, "The figure at the gate is someone who has been to that property before, lived with someone, or visited regularly." The shoulder, the head, turn, the familiarity of the gate approach. He stared at the page. He didn't write the next thing he was thinking, not yet, because writing it would make it the next thing have to say to de Vivienne, and he wasn't ready to do that until he was certain. And he wasn't certain yet. He closed the notebook. Outside Clover Hill was fully quiet now, the deep quiet of small towns after 2 a.m. when even the persistent sounds had given up. In his jacket pocket, Owen's note, "Do not leave the house. Call me when you wake," was folded into quarters. He thought about 14 years of learning to identify things from incomplete evidence, about what the incomplete evidence on the footage page meant, about the shoulder, the gait, the familiarity. And he thought about how some information, once you had it, changed the shape of everything that came before it. How certain facts were less like discoveries and more like lenses. How looking through a new lens didn't create a new picture. It just finally brought the existing one of focus. He turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a while longer. Then he went to bed. In the morning, he would know what to do with what he knew. Morning would come, it always did. He spent 2 days with the footage before he said anything. Not because he wasn't sure. He was sure by the end of the first day, after he'd gone through every frame of every camera from the past 3 weeks and cross-referenced the timestamps with what he knew about who had access to the property and when. The shoulder asymmetry. The specific tilt of the head at the gate. The way the figure navigated the side yard without hesitation, without the searching quality of someone unfamiliar with the space, moving through it like muscle memory, like somewhere you'd been before dark fell and the reason for being there had changed. He spent the second day figuring out how to say it. There was no good version of this sentence. He'd said hard things before, to families about vehicles that weren't worth repairing, to Owen about Rebecca in the careful language of a man who wanted to be honest without being catastrophic, himself in the truck after Francis had laid out the legal reality of what contesting a manufactured violation actually cost in time and money and energy. But this was different. This was someone's life, not a verdict about machinery. He called Vivienne on Thursday morning and asked if he could come by that afternoon. She said yes, which she always said, and then asked if something had happened, which told him the quality of the question had come through even in 4 words. After the garage closes, he said, 4:30. She was at the kitchen table when he arrived, laptop open but screen dimmed, the posture of someone who had been waiting and had decided to occupy the wait productively and then stopped being able to. She looked at him when he came in, and whatever she saw in his face made her close the laptop. He sat down, put his phone on the table between them with the footage already cued to the timestamp. "Watch from the beginning," he said. She watched. He watched her watch. Not the footage, but her face, looking for the moment the recognition arrived because he needed to know whether she got there on her own, or whether he'd have to say it. She got there on her own. At 09, her face changed. Not dramatically, not a visible flinch or a sharp intake of breath. Just a specific stillness that was different from the stillness she usually wore, the kind that came from something landing that you'd been half expecting without letting yourself expect it. She watched the clip to the end. Set the phone down, looked at the table. "Connor," she said. "I think so. You think or you know." The shoulder, the way he moved through the yard. The gate, he didn't hesitate at the latch. Someone who's never been to that property hesitates at the latch. He kept his voice informational. Sutsu needs soft in a way that would feel patronizing. She didn't need softness, she needed accuracy. "I could be wrong, but I've looked at it for 2 days and I don't think I am." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he didn't try to fill it. "How long ago did he stop coming around?" Jeffrey finally said. 4 years after the accident. She looked up from the table. Her eyes were dry, which he understood was not an absence of feeling but a presence of something else. The same override that had kept her face still in the diner, the same mechanism that had let her document her own damaged wheelchair in the middle of the night without her hands shaking. The thing that kept working when the alternative was unacceptable. We had one conversation in the hospital. I asked him directly, I don't know what I expected. I think I expected him to tell me I was wrong. He didn't say anything. He left. And then he didn't come back. He knew. She said it without inflection, which was the hardest way to say it. He's working for Aldrich now. Or working for someone who's working for Aldrich, which means Aldrich knows he's my brother. She looked at the dimmed screen of her laptop, which means they found him, recruited him, used the debt or what he owes, or who as the mechanism. She was quiet again. Or he went to them. He didn't say anything to that. Both possibilities were real and she knew it. I need to talk to him. She said it the way she said decisions she'd already made. Not a declaration, just a reporting of what was now true before anything else. Before Francis, before Wold, before Calloway. She looked at Geoffrey. Will you come? Not a question. Or a question that already knew its answer. Yes, he said. They met Connor Hartwell at a diner in Waynesboro, 40 minutes west of Clover Hill, because Vivienne had chosen it, and she had chosen it correctly. Far enough that they wouldn't encounter anyone who knew any of them. Close enough to get there and back in an afternoon. Connor was already there when they arrived, sitting in a booth near the back with a coffee he hadn't touched, wearing a canvas jacket with a collar turned up against the November cold, looking like a man who had been running a particular calculation for a long time and had run out of variables to manipulate. He was 34 years old and he looked 50. Not in the physical way, not in the face specifically, but in the way that certain weights aged people from the inside. The particular gravity of someone carrying something that had grown heavier every year it went unaddressed. He looked at Vivienne when they slid into the booth across from him. Then at Geoffrey, then back at Vivienne. His voice keckful. How long have you known? 2 days. Vivienne put her phone on the table face down. Camera footage. Connor looked at his coffee, picked it up, put it back down without drinking. I didn't hurt you, he said, and then immediately, as if hearing how that sounded. I mean, I know that I did. I mean the chair. I didn't want to actually hurt you. Bending the frame joint on a mobility device so it fails at speed is wanting to hurt someone, Connor. He flinched. I was told it would just make the chair uncomfortable, that you'd be more willing to sell if He stopped, pressed his mouth together. That's not an explanation. I'm not trying to offer that as an explanation. Geoffrey sat beside Vivienne and said nothing. This conversation belonged to two people and he was not one of them. How long have you been working with Aldrich? Vivienne said. 3 months. Coleman found me. Connor turned the coffee cup on the saucer, a small, repetitive motion he seemed unaware of. I owe money. Not catastrophic money by some people's new standards. Catastrophic by mine. Coleman said he knew I was your brother and that there might be a way to, he called it resolve the situation. That I could help facilitate a smooth acquisition process and my situation would be addressed. How much? 42,000. Business loan that went wrong. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. You could have called me. No, he kept turning the cup up. Vivienne, I could have called you for the past 4 years about a lot of things and I didn't. The money wasn't. I wasn't going to call you about money after everything. He looked up. After what I did. The diner around them. The midday quiet of a Wednesday, 2 other tables occupied. A waitress refilling the coffee station in no particular hurry. The ordinary architecture of a space that had no idea what kind of conversation was happening in the back booth. Tell me what happened at the accident. Vivienne's voice was measured, not cold. The specific temperature of someone asking a question they have needed to ask for 4 years and have finally arranged the conditions to ask correctly. I want to hear it from you, all of it. Connor was quiet for a moment, then he told her he'd been 29. Theo Aldrich had been at a party at a friend's place in Roanoke, and Connor had been there because he knew the host, and Theo had needed a ride, and Connor had offered because he'd had less to drink, and that was the math he'd done, and it was wrong math, but it was the math he'd done. He'd been over the legal limit. He hadn't felt over it. He'd believed his own assessment of his own impairment, which was exactly the failure mode that the legal threshold existed to prevent. The light was red. He didn't cease it in time. He'd run the red at Route 11 and Crawford, and hit the vehicle proceeding lawfully through the intersection. When he got out of the car, his first conscious thought after the impact had been that the family had money and he didn't, and Theo was in the passenger seat and Theo was uninjured, and the person in the other car was still. He could see through the windshields that she was still, and he didn't know yet what that meant. His second thought, which arrived approximately 15 seconds after the first, and which he had spent 4 years trying to stop hearing. Nobody saw which of us was driving. He hadn't decided anything in that moment. He'd just gotten out and stepped back from the driver's door, and Theo had gotten out and moved to the driver's position, and neither of them had said a word to each other. The geometry of guilt and opportunity, and the specific moral vacancy that arrives when you're standing in the middle of something catastrophic and you see a way out. The man from the gas station, Pete Sanger, had come over, had looked at Theo in the driver's position and asked if he was okay, had registered what he was registering. Theo had said, "Please stop," had looked at Connor standing several feet as he said it. 17 minutes later, a man named Arthur Aldrich arrived, Theo's father, in a suit at a crash scene before the police had finished their initial documentation. The way only a person who had been called immediately, urgently, by someone with presence of mind to make that call while his passenger was still unconscious in the other vehicle could arrive. Arthur Aldrich had spoken to Pete Sanger, had spoken to Connor, had spoken to the responding officers in a way that Connor had not been close enough to hear but whose effects he had watched in real time. The way the documentation process shifted, the way questions were directed, the way a timeline was constructed that no one explicitly lied to create, and that nevertheless did not reflect what had actually happened. Connor had left the state for 6 months. When he came back, Vivienne was in a rehabilitation facility, and the case had closed, and the settlement had been reached, and he had looked at the number in the newspaper filing and understood that it was real money, but that it was also, in a very specific way, the price that had been placed on what he had done, and not in the 17 minutes before Arthur Aldrich arrived. He had not called her. He had told himself he would when he figured out what to say, and 4 years had passed in that figuration, and he had never found the words, and the words had never found him. And Slade Coleman had called 6 months ago and offered to make $42,000 in bad debt disappear. The booth was very quiet when he finished. Vivienne sat with it for a long moment. Then, the blood alcohol test. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the impact. Connor nodded. They waited long enough. I don't know what was arranged and what just happened because of the delay. I wasn't part of those arrangements. I just didn't contradict them, which is the same thing. She said it without heat. Without the performance of forgiveness or its absence. Just a correction of a category error he'd been making for 4 years. Not contradicting something you know is false is the same as the lie. He didn't argue. Yes, I need you to make a statement. Everything you just told me to the right people. She held his gaze, Sheriff Calloway, and possibly a reporter named Stephen Wold. Connor's jaw worked. I understand. You don't have to decide right now. The modification in her voice was small, precise. But I need you to know that's what I need. He looked at his sister across the Formica table, the woman who had learned to use a wheelchair because of 17 minutes in which he had made no active choices, only failed to make the active choice that would have required something he hadn't had. And he said, with the simplicity of someone who had run out of other options, "Tell me when and where. I'll be there." Jeffrey drove back through the November hills with Vivienne in the passenger seat and the heater running, and neither of them speaking for the first 20 minutes. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that happened between people when what had just occurred needed to be carried a while before it could be discussed. Eventually, without looking away from the road, "You all right? That's a question with complicated answers." She was watching the hills go past, the November colors still on the higher elevations, the valley already bare. I spent 4 years being angry at Connor in a way I couldn't justify to myself because I didn't have evidence of anything. Only the fact that he was there and then he wasn't. A pause. Now I have the evidence and I understand what happened and I don't feel better about it. I just feel like I can see it properly. Seeing something clearly doesn't make it hurt less. No, she turned from the window, but it makes it yours. The version of the accident I've been carrying was shaped by people who had a reason to shape it. This one is just what happened. She looked at him. I prefer what actually happened. Even when it's worse. He understood that completely. He'd had a version of Rebecca's illness for about 8 months that the hospital's optimistic framing had constructed for him. A version in which the numbers could still go the other way. And when the numbers stopped being able to go the other way, he'd understood that the version he'd been carrying had protected him from something while also preventing him from preparing for what was real. The clarity had been its own kind of violence. He'd also preferred it. He didn't say any of this. It wasn't the moment for his own history. He just drove. Francis Whitmore received the footage clip and Connor Hartwell's contact information by 6 that evening and called Jeffrey at 7 with a quality of focus in her voice that arrived when she was working something and could see the shape of where it was going. Connor Hartwell makes a notarized statement, she said. Calloway takes that to the State Inspector General's office rather than filing it in the county system. It needs to go above the county level, above any channel where Aldrich connections could intercept it. And Stephen Wold gets everything that's documentable. The violation pattern, the acquisition timeline, the Commercial Standards Office authorization structure. A pause. The accident is Vivienne's decision. It's her information. I'm not going to tell her what to do with it. She's already decided, Fed. A short silence on the line. How? She's going to give it to Wold. Francis made a sound that was not quite approval but was adjacent to it. Then the timing matters. Whatever Wold publishes needs to land before the County Planning Commission rezoning hearing. Aldrich has filed for preliminary approval on the corridor project. It's on the agenda for the second Thursday of November. Jeffrey pulled up the calendar on his phone. 11 days. That's tight. It's tight. But it's a reason, not an obstacle. France's voice had the specific quality of a woman who had been doing this for 34 years and knew the difference between problems that required more time and problems that required better coordination. Get me Calloway, get me Wold, and keep Vivienne's board call tomorrow. She can't let her company show strain right now because Aldrich's lawyers will use it. He relayed all of this to Vivienne that night. She was in her home office, which she'd been in twice before, and which was exactly what Owen had identified it as during his unsolicited architectural tour months ago. 3 monitors at the correct height. A whiteboard on the wall that currently had a software drive migration diagram on it that Jeffrey could not parse but that clearly represented a significant amount of organized thinking. She listened to Francis's timeline, looked at the whiteboard, back at him. The board call is at 9 tomorrow, she said. 40 minutes, routine check-in, I'll handle it. She reached for her notebook. Real paper, not digital, the one she used when she was thinking rather than recording. Calloway first, I'll call him tonight, then Wold. And Connor, she wrote the name, looked at it. He needs Francis, too. For the statement, he shouldn't do that without his own representation. Francis will know someone in Roanoke, I'll ask her. He was at the door, Akaton Kriegs in hand, when she said Jeffrey. He turned. She was looking at the whiteboard. The migration diagram, the boxes and arrows. The organized structure of a system she'd built from a problem no one else had solved for the clients she'd decided to serve. She'd built all of it from a hospital bed, from a rehabilitation facility, from a house on Maple Street that she'd configured with lever handles and flush thresholds, and a desk at the right height. Every element a decision made in the precise knowledge that nobody was going to make it for her. My grandmother used to say something, she said. Quiet, not looking at him yet. She said the difference between people who came through hard things and people who didn't wasn't toughness. It was whether they could find one person who was still on their side when they'd stopped being sure they deserved one. She looked at him then. I'm not saying you're that person. I'm saying you should be behaving like someone who decided to be. He stood in the doorway with his keys. Get some sleep, he said. Which was a deflection, and they both knew it, and she accepted it the same way she accepted most things, with perfect awareness of what it was. But he thought about it on the drive home, about the difference between deserving and having, about Rebecca, who had never once in 11 years asked whether he deserved the version of himself she was committed to, who had just committed, and about the woman in the blue house who had asked him directly, in the diner, once she'd assessed him enough to bother, "Are there you doing it? Not thank you for doing it." Why? As if the reason was information she needed, which it was, because she was someone who needed accurate information about the system she was operating within, including the people. Stephen Wold arrived in Clover Hill on a Friday morning. He was younger than Jeffrey had expected. 36 maybe, with the specific alertness of people who had trained themselves to arrive at a story without pre-existing conclusions and had gotten good enough at it that the alertness had become the default state. He drove a Subaru with a cracked phone mount on the dash and a back seat occupied by what appeared to be 3 months of printed research materials. They met at the garage. Jeffrey had 2 hours before his first appointment, and Wald had driven from Richmond. which meant he'd left before 6 and was running on whatever coffee he'd found on the highway. Jeffrey made him a mug from the office machine. Wald accepted it with the expression of a man who had not been offered coffee and was recalibrating his assessment accordingly. "You have documentation?" Wald said. Not a question. He'd come because Francis had briefed him, and Francis had told him what was there. 3 violation notices, photographed and timestamped. The original acquisition correspondence Vivian received in chronological order. The Bridgeway Solutions connection, Aldrich to Derek Sims. The Gerald Hop vouching record on Aldrich-related county decisions. The Commercial Standards Office authorization documents. Jeffrey set the folder on the workbench. The police report from the second wheelchair incident and camera footage of the person who accessed the property. Wald opened the folder, went through it at a pace that suggested he was reading, not skimming. After several minutes, the authorization documents for the Commercial Standards Office. These are public record. County administrative filings. Francis pulled them. And the Hop-Aldrich Advisory Board interaction, you have that documented? Corporate filings. 2 meetings listed in the Aldrich Development Annual Reports, Hop named as attendee. Wald made a note, turned a page, turned another. He was looking at the Bridgeway Solutions connection now, the Derek Sims employment history. This alone is a story, he said. The inspector who issued the violations worked for the developer's consulting firm before his county appointment. That's a story. He looked up. But you're telling me there's something bigger under it. There's something that makes this specific, Jeffrey said. Not just a general pattern of regulatory abuse. Something that explains why this property owner specifically. He held Wald's gaze. Vivian Hartwell needs to tell you that part herself. I can't tell you on her behalf. Wald nodded. When can I speak with her? Tomorrow afternoon. She's asking for 1 day. She has board business this morning she can't reschedule. That's fine. Wald closed the folder. I want you to understand what I'm building. I've been looking at Aldrich Development's acquisition activity across 6 counties for 5 months. The pattern is consistent. Identify a target corridor, make an initial offer, establish manufactured regulatory pressure when the offer is declined, escalate until the property owners either sell or are too legally and financially exhausted to resist. He looked at the folder on the workbench. Harlow County is the largest project, the most complex. I can document the font, but completely, it anchors the whole piece. A pause. What I can't do is publish anything I can't independently verify. That includes anything that came from law enforcement sources without the source willing to be named. Callaway. If Callaway gives me something on background, I can work with that. If he gives me something on record, I can use it. Wald picked up his coffee. What's his position? His position as an inconsistencies in a close file and referred it to the state IG's office because he didn't trust the local chain of custody. Jeffrey paused. He's going on record about what he found. I talked to him yesterday. Wald went very still. He found something in the accident file. I'll let him tell you what he found. The meeting with Vivian happened on Saturday afternoon at the Blue House. Wald brought the recorder, as Vivian had expected him to, and she'd cleared the kitchen table of the usual accumulated working material in a way that Jeffrey recognized as preparation, not for formality, but for clarity. She wanted a clean surface for a conversation that required precision. She'd told Jeffrey the night before that she had decided not to rehearse, that she was going to say what she knew in the order it happened and let the accuracy of it carry what needed to be carried. She was right. He sat at the end of the table as he'd been asked, and for 3 hours he watched Vivian Hartwell do the most difficult thing he'd seen anyone do voluntarily. She described the accident with clinical accuracy. She described the settlement process with the same accuracy, including the details that reflected badly on her own judgment. Trusting the framing she'd been given, accepting the documentation she'd been told was complete, signing papers in a rehabilitation bed when her capacity to push back was at its most compromised. She described what Callaway had found, what Connor had told her, what Pete Sanger had seen at the gas station corner 4 years ago. She cried once. Very briefly, in the middle of a sentence about the settlement meeting, a single moment where the composure came apart at one specific sequence, and then about soars later, was back. She didn't apologize for it. She just continued the sentence. Wald asked careful questions, the kind of questions that opened rather than directed. He asked her what she knew and when she'd learned it and how, and he did not ask her how she felt about it, because he clearly understood that what she felt about it was already present in every sentence and didn't need to be named. Jeffrey said nothing for the full 3 hours. He'd been asked to be there. He was there. That was the whole of his role, and he understood it and sat in it the way he'd learned to sit in positions that required nothing but presence, steadily, without needing to fill the space, without announcing that he was there except by continuing to be. When it was done, when Wold had clicked off the recorder and closed his notebook and said what he could confirm and what the timeline was and what he would need to verify independently before anything ran, Vivienne said very quietly, "How long?" "I need 2 weeks minimum to verify the accident file details independently of Calloway's account. I have a contact at the IG's office I can talk to. I need Pete Sanger's statement directly, not through an intermediary." Wold looked at his notes. "I need Connor Hartwell. On record if he'll do it." "He'll do it," Vivienne said. "The Planning Commission hearing is November 14th. She looked at Wold. "I know the timing. I'll do everything I can to be ready before then." He met her eyes across the table. "I want to be clear about one thing. This story runs when it's ready. Not before. If I rush it and something is wrong, it hurts you and everyone else who went on record. I'm not going to do that." A pause. "But I also want to be clear that what I have here, what you've given me today, changes the scope of what I'm writing. This isn't just a story about regulatory abuse in a property acquisition. This is a story about a family that has been protecting itself from the consequences of a drunk driving accident for 4 years, and is now targeting the person most damaged by that accident as part of a real estate project." He picked up his recorder. "I'm going to do this right." After Wold left, they sat in the kitchen in the quiet that followed. The November light through the window was the flat gray-white of a cloud cover that had settled in and intended to stay. The herbs in the window box had gone dormant, the basil long dead, only the rosemary still making an argument for itself. Jeffrey looked at her. She looked at the table for a while. "Then I feel like I held a door shut for a long time and I just opened it and I don't know yet what's on the other side. Whatever's there, you'll deal with it." "I know," she looked up. "That's not what's strange. The strange part is not knowing in advance." A small pause. "I'm usually better at knowing in advance. Nobody knows what's on the other side of a door they've never opened." She held his gaze. "That's either very simple or very profound, and I genuinely cannot tell which." "Neither can I," he said, and she almost smiled. The article ran on a Wednesday, 6:15 in the morning, Virginia State Tribune digital edition. Jeffrey read it at the kitchen table before Owen woke up with the good coffee and the November now. Light beginning to come through the east window of the kitchen. Wold had done it right. The first half was the regulatory abuse story. Precise, documented, devastating in the specific way that precision was devastating when applied to something that had been constructed to look legitimate. The Commercial Standards Office, its authorization, Derek Sims, Gerald Harp, the voting record, the Bridgeway Solutions connection, the pattern across 6 counties with Harlow the apex, every claim sourced, every figure verifiable. The second half was the accident. Wold had 2 independent sources for Pete Sanger's account. Sanger himself on record, with his notarized statement from Calloway, and a retired EMT who had responded to the scene and who had given a statement to Wold that aligned with Sanger's on every material point. The blood-alcohol timeline, the presence of legal counsel before documentation was complete, the 4th witness line that had appeared in the intake document and it is from everything after. Vivienne's quotes were measured and exact and said what they needed to say without a word more. Connor's statement was in the second-to-last section, a paragraph, attributed by name, saying that he had been the driver of the vehicle and that the on-scene substitution had occurred with his knowledge and without his resistance. He had worked with Francis's colleague in Roanoke to prepare the statement. He had understood what it meant for himself before he gave it. Jeffrey's name appeared once, as the owner of an adjacent property who had received a comparable violation notice and who had independently confirmed the acquisition timeline. That was all. That was exactly right. He sat with the article for a long time. Owen came downstairs at 7:02 wearing mismatched socks and the expression of someone who had slept deeply and wasn't apologizing for it. "What are you reading?" "An article." Jeffrey closed his laptop. "Do you want eggs?" Owen sat down.
Is it about the thing that's been happening?
He looked at son, 8 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a shirt with a faded dinosaur on it that had been washed so many times the specific species was no longer identifiable. He looked at Owen and thought about Rebecca's note in his wallet and about what it meant to not be the lonely hero, and about the fact that Owen had measured Vivienne's doorframes with the typesis measure from the garage and written the results on a piece of paper that Jeffrey still kept in his jacket pocket. Well, yes, it is okay now. It's better. It still has a ways to go. Owens considered this with the scientific gravity he brought to structural problems. But it's moving in the right direction. Yeah, it is. Okay. Owen reached for the orange juice. Eggs would be good. The rezoning hearing was Thursday morning. Well, the County Planning Commission convened at 9, and by 8:30 the hearing room, which held 100 people if everyone was committed to the enterprise of sharing personal space, had achieved that number and was working on more. Well, Jeffrey had not anticipated the size of it. Wald's article had run 18 hours earlier, and in those 18 hours something had happened in Harlow County that Jeffrey understood intellectually as the mechanics of a story reaching critical mass, but that was different to stand inside than to understand from a distance. People he recognized Sandra Ogle, no tray in hand, the first time he'd ever seen her without one. Dale Pruitt, the folder on his knee, Patrick Shields in the second row with his documentation. 2 people in the back he recognized as staff from the State Attorney General's office from the photograph in Wald's article, identifiable now by the lanyards they wore that the photograph had mentioned. Warren Aldrich was in the front row on the right side, suit that cost real money. 2 attorneys, one on each side. Slade Coleman. The composed arrangement of a man who had been told things were still manageable. Jeffrey and Vivienne took near the center aisle. Francis was in the 3rd row. Brian Calloway was standing against the back wall in uniform, which was a decision that communicated something specific about what he thought the room required. The commission chair, Angela Voss, 12 years in the seat, the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that how she ran a meeting was a form of communication itself, called the session to order at 9 sharp, and moved through the preliminary items in the brisk manner of someone who understood that the room had not assembled for the preliminary items. Then she said, "The Commission has received significant correspondence since yesterday evening in response to reporting in the Virginia State Tribune. We are aware of the reporting. We will allow public comment before taking any action on the Aldrich Development rezoning application." The chair notes that representatives of the Virginia Attorney General's office are present today as observers. Aldrich's lead attorney rose without being asked and offered a brief statement characterizing the Tribune article as verified allegations that bore no legal relationship to the rezoning application before the commission. He sat down with the contained confidence of a man who believed the line he'd been paid to deliver. Public comment ran 45 minutes. Patrick Shields spoke about the Foundation report with the quiet authority of a man holding 22 years of correct work in his hands, and describing exactly one instance where it had been characterized as otherwise. He had the photographs. He had the original inspection sign-offs. He had, as he put it in the flat language of someone who worked with materials and not with rhetoric, everything he needed to demonstrate that the violations cited did not exist. Dale Pruitt walked through the timeline. Acquisition letter, refusal, violation notice, for 3 properties on the block, including 2 that hadn't been publicly mentioned before, owners who had received letters and said nothing until the article gave them a context for what had happened to them. Pete Sanger stood at the podium and said 4 sentences. He said them to the room and not to any one person in it. When he finished, the specific silence that followed was the kind that a room produced when it was processing something that had changed the weight of everything else. Then Vivienne moved to the podium. He watched her from the center aisle. The adjustment of the microphone, not asking anyone's help, just doing it. The straightening that happened when she was about to speak formally, not a performance of composure, just composure to itself, which had a different texture. The way she looked at the 7 commissioners before she said a word, long enough to make the look mean something. Her voice, when it came, was level, deliberate. The voice of someone who had organized exactly what she intended to say and was going to say it precisely. "My name is Vivienne Hartwell. I have lived on Maple Street in Clover Hill for 4 years. I run a software company from my home that employs 31 people and that I built in this town because I needed to rebuild my life somewhere, and I chose here, and I have not regretted it until the last 4 months." She paused. "I'm not going to describe the accident in detail today. You've read the reporting. You know what I know now about how that investigation was conducted and what the limitations of the settlement I signed actually meant. She looked at the commissioners. What I want to say is this. For 4 months, I received manufactured violation notices targeting the modifications that allow me to live independently in my home. My wheelchair was damaged twice, once in public, once in my own yard at night. My brother was recruited to assist in that second incident by people who knew his financial situation and knew his relationship to me. The word brother had a weight in the room. She let it have it. This is not a rezoning application. This is the end stage of a campaign that began 4 years ago and that was designed from the beginning to operate in the space where legitimate legal process and deliberate harm are difficult to distinguish. She looked at each commissioner in turn. I am asking you to make that distinction today. I believe you can see what's in front of you. I believe that's actually what this commission is for. She turned, came back to her seat. The room held its breath for 2 full seconds. Then it decided to stop holding it. He didn't clap. He sat beside her and was there, which was what he'd come to do. She looked straight ahead and her hands were in her lap and they were not completely steady and she did not try to make them steady and that seemed right. Angela Voss called a recess at 10:47. The recess was not on the agenda. In the hallway, Francis found them near the water fountain, with the controlled expression of a lawyer managing information that had not yet been formed but whose shape she could read clearly. The AG observers didn't come to observe, Francis said. Someone at the state level read the article this morning and made calls before 8. The rezoning is going to be voted down. You can see it in how Voss handled the recess. She's giving the attorneys time to advise Aldrich to withdraw voluntarily rather than take a public vote against. She looked at Vivian, the civil case reopened. The new evidence changes the settlement terms substantially. That process takes time, but it starts from a very different position now. Vivian nodded. Looking at the hallway, the institutional linoleum, the fluorescent light, the bulletin board with its layers of community messages, none of which were about any of this. How much time? She was asking about the civil case, a year, maybe more, Francis said it straight. It will require you to revisit the accident in detail, in depositions, possibly in court, I know. A pause. I'd rather revisit it with the correct information than continue to live inside the incomplete version. She looked at Francis. Does that make sense legally? It makes sense in every way that matters. Aldrich's attorneys withdrew the rezoning application at 11:19, 5 minutes before Angela Voss reconvened the session. The paperwork was filed efficiently, the way things were filed when the outcome had been predetermined, and the remaining task was making it look like a decision rather than a retreat. Slade Coleman walked out of the building with his phone at his ear, not looking at anyone. Warren Aldrich stood at the exit for a moment. He looked at the room he was leaving. The 100 people who had rearranged their Wednesday mornings to be in it. The farmers and businesses and tailors who had shown up without being asked. The Attorney General observers with their lanyards. The camera from the television station that had not been there when he'd arrived. He looked at it all with the expression of someone who had been the largest person in rooms for so long that they had stopped being able to read rooms that didn't arrange themselves around them. Then he left. Angela Voss reconvened at 11:24, noted the withdrawal, and, with the precise language of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say the next thing, announced that the Commission was opening a formal inquiry into the Office of Commercial Standards and that all pending violation orders against properties on the Maple-Hargrove corridor were suspended pending the outcome of that inquiry. Suspended, not dismissed, suspended. Francis, from the 3rd row, wrote something in her notebook with the deliberate care of someone who wrote things down when they were worth keeping. The formal inquiry findings came 3 weeks later in December. The Office of Commercial Standards had been established outside standard oversight protocols. 4 of its 7 inspectors had been hired through a process that bypassed normal background review and competitive selection. All violation orders against the corridor properties were formally vacated. Jeffrey received an official letter on a Monday, a real one. County seal, proper return address, the specific bureaucratic weight of something that meant what it said. His compliance record was clean, no further action. He put it in the drawer in the office. Next to the original violation notice, they made an odd pair, the weapon and the rescission in the same drawer, as if the drawer itself was the record of what had happened. Theo Aldrich retained separate criminal defense counsel in December. The Attorney General's review of the accident investigation was ongoing, which was the phrase that meant it was moving without meaning it was moving fast. Frances said not to expect speed from the criminal process, but to expect eventually, which she said was rarer than it sounded. Connor Hartwell left Clover Hill after giving his statement. Vivienne knew where he was. They had spoken twice since the diner in Waynesboro. Brief calls, careful. The specific phone call quality of people, rebuilding something from the foundation because everything above the foundation had come down. She didn't discuss these calls with Jeffrey in detail, and he didn't ask for detail. This was hers. Sandra Ogle got a letter from the county in December that her plumbing inspection violation had been vacated. She came into the garage point to tell it to Jeffrey, which surprised him slightly because Sandra's communication style had always been in the medium of delivered food and exchanged nods rather than explicit announcement. She stood in the bay door in her coat and told him. And then she said, I should have said something sooner in the diner and for it. He looked at her, sent me a message at 2 in the morning when it mattered. That's not the same. No, he said, but it counts. She stood there for another moment with the expression of someone deciding whether that was enough, and then she decided it was, and went back to the diner. He thought about that for a while, about what it cost people to do the thing slightly late versus never, about the math they ran and how the math changed and what changed it and whether there was a lesson in that or just a fact. He thought there was probably just a fact. Stephen Wald's follow-up piece ran in January, after the formal inquiry findings were public. It was shorter than the first, 400 words, clean. The brief declarative language of a reporter who had said the large things and now needed only to note what had followed from them. The Office of Commercial Standards vacated. The IG referral on the accident investigation confirmed. The statement from Aldrich Development's communications team that said nothing specific in 40 words. The civil case moved. Slowly, as Frances had said. But it moved. Vivienne's board learned what had happened in January, in a call she ran herself, in the precise language she'd chosen. She told Jeffrey about it afterward, in the garage on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd taken to coming by in the late afternoons when her workday wound down. Not every day, but often enough that he'd replaced the folding chair with a proper stool that didn't require reconfiguring every time. Two of them asked whether I needed to step back from operational leadership temporarily, she said, to manage the legal situation. He looked at her over the car he was servicing. What did you say? I said the legal situation was being managed by competent attorneys and that my operational capacity was unchanged, and that I'd appreciate not being asked that question again. A pause, in slightly more measured language. How did they take it? Quietly. A small expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. I've been running this company for 3 years, so they know what I do, and they know how I do it. I think 2 of them asked because they thought they should, and the other 5 were waiting for me to answer so we could move on, and moved on. And moved on. We approved the Charlotte expansion in the same call. He turned back to the car. $40 million company on a good quarter. She opened her laptop. Don't make it strange. I'm not. You have a specific look when you're doing math about something I've said. I'm not doing math. You're doing math. But there was something in her voice, the slight lift in it, the thing that had been there more often lately, the quality of someone who had stopped editing for safety in a particular conversation. She said, the Charlotte contract is good. It'll put us at 43 if everything closes on schedule. Is it going to? It usually does when I'm the one watching it. She pulled something on the screen. Also, Patrick Shields called me. He has a new project on the south end of town and wants to know if I'd recommend the countertop fabricator I used for the kitchen renovation. Good fabricator. I told him so. He's going to call them. She typed something, stopped. He also said, and he's not a man who says this thing that he was glad it worked out. He's been doing honest work in this county for 22 years. Someone trying to put fraudulent findings on his record. Jeffrey set down the socket wrench. Yeah, I think he's glad. The February evening arrived the way February evenings arrived in the valley, early and cold and with the specific quantitative dollars that makes interior feel like something earned rather than given. The kind of night that made a lit kitchen feel like an argument against the season. Vivienne had cooked. She did this sometimes now, arriving at Birch Street on weekend evenings with ingredients and the specific efficiency of someone who had grown up watching a grandmother cook the way other people watched craftsmen work. This time it was her grandmother's chicken stew, which she'd described once as the thing her grandmother made in February, because in her grandmother's philosophy, February was the month that required the most direct assistance from the people you trusted. Owen had eaten 2 bowls and was currently on the floor of the living room with a library book about deep-sea ecosystems and a commentary track running at low volume about things he was discovering that he felt Jeffrey should know. The commentary was not requested, but was also not unwelcome, which was the specific frequency of Owen's presence in general. Jeffrey was washing the bowls in the kitchen while Vivian sat at the table with a cup of tea and the quarterly report she'd been reading before dinner and had set aside to make room for the meal and now picked back up. This was how evenings had come to work sometimes. Not every week, but often enough to have become a pattern that none of them had named, because naming it would have required a conversation that none of them seemed to need to have. The kitchen was warm. Outside, snow had started. The quiet kind, without wind, the kind that made the yard look like something out of a winter anyone might want to live in. Owen, Vivian said, without looking up from the quarterly report. The anglerfish. The bioluminescent appendage, it's called the esca, from the living room. How do you know that? I read you read about anglerfish. I've read about many things. She turned a page. The light is produced by bioluminescent bacteria that live in the esca in a symbiotic relationship. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the book, looking at Vivian with the specific expression of someone whose area of expertise has just been encroached upon by someone he hadn't known was a relevant party. It says that in the book. I know, I've read the book, this exact book. Different book, same information. Owen looked at Jeffrey. Jeffrey kept washing dishes. Owen looked back at Vivian, made a decision. Do you want to see the page about the dragonfish? Yes, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it by the quality of the attention she brought when Owen brought the book and showed her the page. The same full attention she spent to board meetings and legal documents and all conversations with Francis redirected completely and without condescension toward an 8-year-old and a dragonfish. Owen explained the dragonfish for 6 minutes. She asked 2 questions. Good ones. Owen answered with the authority of someone whose expertise had been properly consulted. Then Owen returned to the living room and the book and the commentary track. And the kitchen was quiet again except for the small sounds of winter making itself known outside. Jeffrey dried his hands, sat down across from her. She looked up from the quarterly report. Have you ever regretted it, she said. Any of it since October? He thought about that with the genuine consideration it deserved. No, not a moment. She held his gaze. Why did you keep going? After the diner. Most people would have. The wheel was fixed. The men sat down. Most people would have called that done. He looked at the table between them. At the empty bowl she'd pushed to the side. At the quarterly report. At the pen she'd been using to make notes in the margin. At her hands. Because though being fixed wasn't the point, he said. The thing that broke it wasn't going to stop because I fixed it once. He paused. And because I'd looked at what was happening and I understood it. And once you understand something and you're in a position to do something about it. He stopped. Considered the rest of the sentence. I don't have a philosophy about this. I just couldn't not. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looks out the window at the snow. My grandmother used to say that the people who came through hard things weren't the ones who were toughest, she said. They were the ones who found one person who was still on their side when they'd stopped being sure they deserved one. She was quiet for a moment. I told you that before. You did? I'm saying it again because I mean it differently now than I did the first time. She looked at him. The first time I said it, I meant it fact about my own situation. Something I was observing. She set down her pen. Now I mean it as something I want you to understand about what this has been. The kitchen held them both, snow against the window. Owen in the other room turned a page, said something quiet to himself about bioluminescence. Jeffrey looked at Vivian Hartwell, who had built a $43 million company from a rehabilitation bed, who had navigated 4 years of incomplete truth with the precision she brought to everything, who had stood in front of a planning commission with unsteady hands and said the exact right thing in the exact right words, who had taught his son the name of an anglerfish's light. I understand, he said, and the snow kept coming, and the kitchen snoots boing other from the other room that could produce its light could produce its smith without any help from a bacteria at all, which he described as, and he was quoting himself here, extremely independent. Vivian looked at the doorway and then at Jeffrey. He looked back. The February night did what February nights do when there are people inside keeping it at bay. It pressed against the glass and lost, and the kitchen held, and the people in it had held, and the particular ordinary extraordinary thing of being in the right place at the right time, with the right people, settled around all of them like something finally, precisely, correctly assembled.